Hi, it's Ryan from Ryan Fowler Photography, and in this video I'm going to be giving you an inside look into the Time-Lapse Fundamentals E-Course. Now this is an entire module, so you are going to learn the basics of time-lapse in here. So setting up, framing, choosing your settings, and then I'm also going to be giving you the editing section. So this is the entire second module of the Time-Lapse Fundamentals E-Course, which is available over on Ryan Fowler Photography. If you are interested in looking at the course further, once you finish this video, there is a link in the description down below which you can click through to the website. It's a very affordable e-course, and I do hope that you enjoy this section of it and that you do decide to take your time-lapse journey even further. So we're going to jump into the 3 videos now. They're all in one section, and I do hope that you enjoy the video.
Welcome to Module 2. In this module, I'm going to be going through the setup process I use when framing and preparing to shoot a time-lapse, as well as an introduction to editing your images and creating your first time-lapse. I've made all of my raw files available to download from the link below this video or in the download sheet, so you can follow along or try on your own with your own editing. Now to get into the video. I'm here in Cabarita Beach, and this first time-lapse is going to be during the day. At the moment it's a bright blue sky day. There's a little bit of cloud hanging around. The waves are rolling in. There's a leading line just down here in front of my camera that I'm going to use to lead into the shot, and then use the beach to follow around. The surf lifesavers, are out there. There's heaps of people on the beach, so it'll be great to show a lot of moving around the scene and throughout the time-lapse. I'm framing up my shots starting with making sure that there will be enough room for a full HD crop in editing. The way I do this is by changing the aspect ratio in camera to 16:9, which, when I turn live view on, gives me a guide to make sure that I can fit everything I need into one frame before I go into post-processing. This won't affect the raw file, but it will allow me to make sure that you won't crop out anything important to the final video. And speaking of raw files, I suggest you shoot in RAW. This will give you the most flexibility in post-processing and get the best quality in the final product. When you're setting up the camera, be sure to use manual mode. I've tried doing time-lapses in AV or aperture priority mode and heard it recommended by other people, but I've found that it's one of the biggest causes of flickering. It's the same for shutter priority mode and P mode on your camera. Manual is the only way to get a consistent exposure, as your settings do not change unless you make the changes. I'm going to talk more about this in Module 4 when we do a day to night time-lapse. One more thing I will set manually is my white balance. In conditions like this, I'm going to be setting my white balance to daylight, as that suits the conditions best. Setting it manually will also stop the camera from changing and causing flickering in color. Now onto the intervalometer. If you're using an external intervalometer, I've embedded one of my most popular YouTube videos, which has an in-depth way to set up your intervalometer, which will show you everything you need to know. For my interval time, however, I'm going to go off the equation I did in Module 1 and set it to 3 seconds for 240 images. A quick note on using an external intervalometer is to set your shooting mode to single shot, because sometimes the remote can send a consistent electrical signal, which will set your shutter consistently if you've got it on continual shooting. If you're using a built-in timing setup, you'll need to set that to the interval you want based on your scene. I understand that this may sound like a lot, but once you get into the flow of setting up your camera, it's very quick and easy to set up your shot and start shooting. In the next video, I'm going to start shooting the scene, and then we'll move into the first post-processing video and get this first time-lapse edited. See you in the next video. Just before I get into photographing the scene, my last tip to share in setting up your shot is to find your focus with autofocus, take a test shot, and make sure it's sharp throughout the scene, and then switch it over to manual focus. This isn't as critical if you're using back button focus, as your camera won't search to find focus every shot, but it's still worth doing in case you knock the camera or button for some reason. Now that I've taken my test shot and checked to make sure that the focal point is right, and I have sharp focus from front to back, it's time to start shooting. The intervalometer is set to take a single image every 3 seconds, and now it's just time to sit back and watch the world go by for 12 minutes. See you in the next video.
Now that we're back in the studio, it's time to get into Lightroom and begin editing. This is a section where most of the magic is made. Just a reminder, at the bottom of this video there is a link to the download sheet where I've put a link to download the full course or just the raw files and videos from this module. Let's jump into Lightroom. Okay, so I've already imported my images here. And what usually happens is when I import, I have a develop preset already applied, which I've actually turned off for the sake of this, just to show you what it does. And it's a camera calibration, so it brings it closer to what I saw on the JPEG version of the photo on the back of my screen. So the profile is usually standardly set to Adobe Standard, but on my camera, I have it set to landscape. And if I click landscape, you can see how much that changes. Now I have put a link down below to the presets I've made for all of these. These are for Canons, so I don't know if they'll work perfectly for Nikon, Fuji, Sony, whatever brand of camera you use, but at least for Canon, these are the ones that get applied. So anyway, you can see if I turn that off and on, what the camera landscape profile really does. It brings out the saturation in here, and it really just helps fast track that editing process a little bit. Okay, so because that is a standard import preset that I usually do, the first thing I'm going to do is make sure I've got my crop and angle adjustments right. So I'm up here in the crop tool, or you can hit the R key on the keyboard, and under aspect you want to go from original and change it down to 16 by 9. Now this is the way that we will produce the final video. So I want to get my framing right here, sort of similar to how I had it when we were out shooting, and I'll just bring down a little bit less of the sky. So it's roughly in the rule of thirds with this intersecting here, the lines leading through, following around into that middle third, and then in the bottom third we've got these lines here as well. So I'm pretty happy with that, and it looks quite straight in camera. So I'll just hit done, and now we have how our time lapse will look. That's a bit of a tongue twister, that one. Okay, so now that we've done that and we've got our crop right and the horizon line is straight, I'm going to just go through the basic editing workflow. So I'm going to start with my highlights, bring those down, which really brings out these cloud details. And my shadows, there's not really too much to do with the shadows. I'll bring them up about halfway to 50, just so it brings out some more detail in these trees and everything here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to find an exact white point and an exact black point. So it has the widest spread in the histogram up here. Now with this white point, I'm going to hold down the Option key on Mac or the Alt key on PC and click and drag it across until I start to see some little flickers of white. So I'll bring it up just until those flickers of white are there, which are on these waves, and now we have a perfect white point so that there is nothing actually blown out. So if I hovered my mouse over here and it was completely blown out and clicked, it would show any highlight clipping, and there's no red dots coming up, so we haven't clipped any highlights, which is great. That's what we want. And then I'm going to do the same for black, but this time I'm going to take it to the left. So I'm holding the Alt or Option key, depending on what system you're using. I'm going to bring it up. I didn't actually have to do this one very much at all. You can see in the right hand side there's black points just starting to come up. And that's just in this little area here, which we expected. And once we've got that, I'm going to introduce a small amount more contrast. You can see how that saturates the colors, which is exactly what we want, because we don't want to oversaturate. We just want it to look natural and bright and colorful and vivid for the viewer. And one thing I do want you to remember is in this time lapse, it's not going to be just one single image. it's going to be a series of 240 images. So it's going to be constantly moving, and this is where we have a little bit of color grading type of thing coming in, but I'll show you that in a minute. Now, you can use your clarity sliders, you can sort of bring that up, but it adds a darker look to it. So I might just introduce a tiny bit, see how that looks. Doesn't really make that much of a difference, but it does just a tiny bit, brings in a minute amount more detail. Now, vibrance and saturation, I'm just going to leave them alone, and I'm going to skip through tone curve, and then HSL panel, we might come back to that one. Split toning is for more mood creation, so if you wanted to add a specific color to the highlight, so if you wanted to make it a bit warmer, you can drag the hue to the warmer side and then increase the saturation, and it will highlight, it will change the color of more of the highlights. But we're not going to do that because we are able to do that in another way. So after split toning, we're going into, actually we'll come back to detail. I'm going to go into lens corrections and remove chromatic aberration, and I will enable profile corrections. Now with this one, it's going to come up with no make. Normally it will automatically introduce something into there, but you're going to have to change this manually to Samyang because that is the lens I was using. But you can see how much distortion this lens has in it. So you can adjust the amount of distortion however you like, but I'm going to leave it where it actually was because it brings a flatter line onto this shore here, which is great, and that's what I'm after. Okay, so we'll head into detail now, and you can see it goes a little bit soft down the back, but that's expected. And then we will find somewhere about the third of our foreground, so you can see that these rocks have some details in them, which is great. I'm just going to increase my sharpness. Now there will be very, very minimal noise in this. It was shot at ISO 100 on a bright sunny day, so there will not be much noise at all. Now with masking, we've just applied sharpening, but that's applied it to the whole image, and we don't really want that. So we're going to add some masking, and I'm going to go with the Alt Option key again, hold that down, click on the masking slider, and just bring it up, and you can see how all of that changes. I can also notice a few lens spots in here, but we'll get rid of that just before we export. So what you do is you increase this slider until it covers the edges of what you want to be sharpened. So white reveals, black conceals, same as the rule in Photoshop. And it's actually, the white is around the edges of these palm trees and shoreline and grass and everything like that. So they're the things that we want sharpened, but not overly sharpened on the blacks, because that's where the noise will start to be introduced. Now if I click and zoom in here, there's really not been any noise introduced at all, which is fantastic. I'm very happy, apart from it being a dead tree, but that's okay. So I'll introduce a very, very minute amount of luminance, which is just noise reduction. So I'll take it to 10, that is the very maximum that we will need. And then I'm going to come down here to effects, and I'm going to bring this highlight, this amount slider to the left, down a little bit, and if I turn that off and on, you can see how it's brought in that big soft vignette, and it really frames the shot. So here it's got nothing around the outsides of it. I'll actually just hit I on the keyboard, which got rid of those little bits of information up there, so we can see the whole image clearly. Now that's turned off, turn it back on, and you can see how it really darkens in here, which is great. Okay, so this is a basic edit done. If I hit the backslash key on the keyboard, you'll see the before and after. And this is just the magic. This is where the magic has really come in. And you'll notice that we haven't actually introduced any vibrance or saturation whatsoever, which is perfect. So before and after. And you can see how much more vibrant and colourful it is just with the small amounts of techniques we've got. And it looks realistic to what we saw on the day. And then with the cloud, so it's brought out all that perfect amount of detail. Okay, now this is where you can really start getting into the nitty-gritty of it if you want to. I'm going to go into the graduated filter
button, or the M key on the keyboard, I'm going to double click Effect, which resets all of these sliders back to 0. So if you've got exposure way up, shadows down, clarity up, dehaze, saturation, whatever you've got on there, double click Effect, it will reset all of these sliders. Now if I click here, it will start dragging down, but you can see how this is a little bit loopy. So if I hold the Shift key, you can see that it goes straight. So I'm holding Shift and it's either going sideways or up and down. Now with this one, I don't actually want it to go up and down too much, so I'm going to angle it a little. I'm going to make it a bit softer. So if I hover over there, you can see where the effect is actually happening. And if I press the O key on the keyboard, that selects to show the selected mask, and it will permanently stay shown while we just adjust to where it's going to go. Now I'm quite happy with where that is, so I'll hit O on the keyboard, and I can actually bring that color down more. And this is sort of the technique known a little as color grading, which is used for movies just to add a bit more ambience. I'm not going to go too much into this because I'm not a video filming expert, but you can add lots of warm tones to your sky. That's very much overdone. Or magenta tones. So if I add a slight magenta tone into here, and I've decreased my exposure, I can do that until it goes black into the night sky, which I really don't want to do. But I will bring it down just a tad to about -0.27. I personally like to keep my images looking quite realistic. That is my personal style. You can edit these how you like, just for the example of the video and doing the first time lapse. Now, if I turn off the graduator filter, turn it back on, you notice how much of a difference there really is. So turn it off, turn it on, and it really adds more tone, more feeling, more mood to the shot. And I can do this again. I can do this as many times as I like. I can go into New, double click Effect, it reset them this time, which is great. And I'm just going to bring up one from the bottom. Now I'm holding the Shift key on the keyboard. These tones in here are quite even, so it's just flat because it was in the middle of the day. So I'm going to drop the exposure a little on this back edge. So -0.25, and it brings in that black tone so that it still draws your eye further into the shot. And I'll hit done, and I'm happy with how this looks. This is a shot that I would be happy to put into a time lapse, and I'll show you the before and after again, just so you can get a bit more of a comparison. So before and after. Okay, now the final little thing is these two dreadful looking lens spots up here. If I hit the Q key on the keyboard or the spot removal tool here, it will bring up this tool. Now I can use the scroll wheel on my keyboard to make it bigger or smaller. On my mouse, sorry. Now on the keyboard, the square bracket keys next to the backslash key, you can actually use those to go up and down and really work with the size. So all I'll do is I will click and click, and those two spots will go away. There you go. Now there is a tiny bit of remnants left, so I'll just paint over them, and they're gone. So now if I want to find more lens spots like this one over here, I can click Visualize Spots and increase or decrease this slider based on the foreground or the sky. Now I know that there is this one over here, and I'm going to just simply click on that, and it's gone. If I unclick Visualize Spots, I can hit Done, zoom out, and there we go. That is pretty much the edit that we need doing. I'll hit the backslash key just to show you before and after. You can see these lens spots are gone, the sky's cleared up, and in a 10-second time lapse, for example, those lens spots will show up.
and they can be quite distracting. There are several time lapses that I've had to go back and remove 1, 2, maybe 3 lens spots just because they were very distracting. Okay, now that we've got these done, I will simply have the first one selected, slide along until we get to here, which is my 240th image in this slide. Now these were a few extra shots that I did on this day in a short film section for the video in the last module, but I've got the first one selected. I will hold the shift key and I will click on the last image. So it's got 240 selected, and then simply come down here to sync. Make sure you click check all and hit synchronize. Now this little bar up here is going to show you the progress of the images being synchronized. Now it may take a little bit of time. My computer is a little bit slower, so it will take a bit longer, but I'm going to hit G on the keyboard and it's going to bring me back to grid view. And you will see that the images are now going to change from being flat to being vibrant, great colors. Now as this is changing, I'm just going to pause the video here. I'll come back once these have all finished, and then we will get the time-lapse exported into LR time-lapse and finalize the first one. Okay, so all of our images have synced. You can see that down to 240 all the way up to number 1, they look uniform. All the way up to there, which is great. That's what we want. We need them to look the same. Now during that little break while these were syncing together, I did open LR Time-Lapse, which is version 4.7.4. Now I'm using the non-licensed version here. This is to show you that you can do this, and it's very, very possible with the free version. Now this is what the general screen opens up to. You may get a notification pop up saying you need to download the DNG converter, which is perfectly fine. The pop-up looks like this. If you get that, simply download it, install it, close out of LR Time-Lapse, reopen it, and it'll be fine. But we don't actually need to go through all of this. It looks very fancy and confusing, but we don't need to go through this at the moment. All we're simply going to do is, with all images from number 1 down to 240 are all selected. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to File and Export. And what we'll do is you'll see this LR time-lapse option. It may be closed when you open it for the first time, so simply click down and we're going to go to LRT JPEG 4K. And that was the option I was already on. This is very, very simple. The LR time-lapse executable is going to be by default applications LR time-lapse 4.app. You can leave that as it is. Output path, that is where you will want to change where the files will be exporting to and where the video will get exported to. And name of sequence, so I'm not going to name it a date. I'm going to name it Cabarita Beach Daylight TL, and that's where the images will get exported to, and that will be fine. Okay, now with this, once you've named it, it's going to show you a whole bunch of advanced options, and we don't need to do a lot with these. We don't need to do anything, in fact. And then this initial sequence number, just leave it as number 1. They do need to be exported as a sequence, and that is what LR Time-Lapse is going to do from here. So that's simply, you choose exactly where they're going to go to and you choose the name of the sequence. That's it. So all I'm going to do now is I will hit export, and it will come up preparing to export, and now it will start exporting up here with the export bar. This will take a little bit of time. It's 240 images being exported as JPEGs at the exact same time, so it will take a little bit of time. So I'm going to pause the video now, and when I come back, what I'll do is I'll show you what happens in LR Time-Lapse when it pops up and what to do with the options further on. So once the exports have been completed and the images have been sent out to LR Time-Lapse, you'll get a little render task was submitted to LR Time-Lapse pop-up come up. I haven't ticked don't show again. You can if you want to, if you don't want to see it, or click OK, which is fine. But now we're going to go into LR Time-Lapse 4, and this is the screen that comes up. Now just remember, this is the not licensed version. So it does have a few little limited things, so you can't do 4K, 6K, 8K, that type of thing. You can only do 720p or full HD at 1080p. Now, with the licensed version, the private license, you can do 4K, which is fantastic, and I will show you that in the final editing video when we do the Holy Grail time-lapse. Now, we've got here MP4 H.264. That is the resolution that we're going to leave it in anyway, no matter what resolution it is. ProRes, you can do that with 4K if you really want to boost it, but that requires the Pro license as well. Now, I'm going to do this at 1080p, and I'm going to force output to 16:9. Now, we cropped that into a 16:9 ratio, which is what we wanted to do, because we were going to export this as a full HD time-lapse. And here is your frame rate. Now, remember what we spoke about in Module 1, which was calculating your time-lapse. So I knew that I was going to do this one at 24 frames per second. And you've got many options here. You've got 23.976. I'm going to do 24 for this one, but then you've got 29.97, 30, 48, 50, 59.94, and finally 60. Now 60 is usually a frame rate reserved for high action, sort of action movie type things. And it looks good when you are doing that sort of thing, but for this one we're just going to go at 24 frames per second. And speed, we're going to leave it at the 1:1 ratio, which is just default. It will just be a normal speed, and that is what we want. Now quality, low, medium or high, just choose high. It's the best way to do it. And color sampling 420, that is the only option we have got in here. Now these two options here are completely up to you. You can show, if you tick Show in Finder, when the export is complete, it will bring a pop-up on your screen, which in my case will show in Finder, and delete intermediary sequence after rendering. I've got that ticked because when you export them, it exports all of the images as JPEGs into a folder, and I really don't need that folder. So instead of manually deleting it, I'm just going to let the program delete it and leave it as it is. So that's pretty much it. The actual exporting of the time-lapse is very simple. Now motion blur, I can talk more about that in the final editing video, but using a low motion blur is sometimes quite nice. Sharpen and copyright overlay, I really don't do that. Sharpening is just for giving that extra bit of sharpness, but we've already sharpened in Lightroom. And copyright overlay, you can do that. It will bring up a little copyright if you want to, but that is entirely your choice. So we've got our settings. These are pretty standard settings. They're pretty much default actually. And all we're going to do is simply hit render video. Now this will not take long. It's really a quick process. Down here you'll see the little blue bar zapping along. Once it finishes, you hear like a little airline ding, ding, ding type thing. That is not the best impression of an airline ding, but anyway, that's what happens on here. There should be an option to turn it off somewhere, but it really doesn't bother me, and it gives me a little notification if I'm not at the computer, so that's fine. You can see how quick this is. and it's just zooming along here, which is fantastic. The only really long point in exporting the time-lapse is getting it from Lightroom to go across into LR Time-Lapse and exporting that final time-lapse. Anyway, this is pretty much done. I'll just pause it very briefly, come back, and I will show you what the time-lapse looks like as soon as it has been exported. I'll put that in the video for you right now. Now that you've seen the final product, you can see how easy it is to create a basic time-lapse during the day. And in the next module, we're going to be heading out again on location to shoot during golden hour, which has a little more dynamic range to deal with. I will see you in the next module.